A poor girl in a wheelchair holds a tattered teddy bear while staring at the door of the orphanage. When the young billionaire arrives to make a donation, she whispers, "My little brother was chosen, but not me, because I'm too much trouble." Upon hearing this, he bursts into tears and his life changes forever. Ethan's black Tesla slid to a stop discreetly in front of the iron gate. He glanced at his Rolex, took a deep, steadying breath, and eyed the crisp brown envelope on the passenger seat. Inside was a check with enough money to fix the entire roof of Maplewood Children's Center. Nothing over the top, nothing to attract news crews, just what was needed. There was a profound strangeness in coming back. 15 years had passed since he'd walked out of this place for the last time, refusing to look back, vowing to never return. Yet here he was, a familiar clamminess slicking his palms and his heart thumping against his ribs as if he were still that same scared, forgotten boy. Ethan hadn't called ahead. He had no desire for welcome committees or saccharine speeches about how he was a shining example of triumph over adversity. He loathed that kind of attention. He craved the clean simplicity of a quick visit, a quiet delivery, and a swift, fanfare-free exit. In his world of endless board meetings and decisions that moved millions, that kind of simple honesty was a rare commodity. 15 minutes tops, he told his driver, who gave a respectful nod. The gate groaned with the same telltale squeak it had in the old days. Some things never changed. A faint smile touched Ethan's lips as he remembered all the times he and the other boys were busted trying to sneak out through that very gate. The ancient metals protest was like an invisible, ever-present guard. The garden seemed to have shrunk. The trees had matured, casting generous pools of shade along the flanks of the main building. The frontage was now a pale, buttery yellow that clashed with his memories. In his day, the walls were a depressing institutional gray, a stark contradiction to his current reality. The courtyard, however, was thrumming with life. Children were a blur of motion, their laughter and shouts echoing in the air. A cluster of them was kicking a soccer ball near the entrance, while others played tag around the swing set. The scene was almost a carbon copy of his recollections, except he was no longer a part of it. Then his gaze snagged on something different. Tucked in a corner of the yard, half swallowed by the shadow of an old oak tree, sat a small child in a blue wheelchair, observing everything in complete silence. She had on a simple floral print dress, her hair pulled into 2 lopsided braids. Clutched tightly in her lap was a brown teddy bear, its fur loved thin, one button eye missing, and visible patches on its paws. Something about her immediately seized Ethan's attention. Perhaps it was the way she tracked the other kids, her stare a potent mix of longing and resignation. Or maybe it was just the stark contrast, a tiny island of stillness in a sea of motion and noise. Without conscious thought, Ethan altered his course. Instead of making a beeline for the administration office, he walked toward the girl. She didn't notice him at first, too engrossed in stroking the bear's frayed ears. "Hi," he said, keeping a respectful distance. The girl glanced up, startled. She studied him with open curiosity, but no fear. "Hi," she answered softly, adjusting the bear on her lap as if to present it. "This is Buddy." "Nice to meet you, Buddy," Ethan said with a genuine smile, tipping his head slightly toward the toy. "You two look like good friends." "He's my best friend," she confirmed with solemnity. "He's been with me since before I came here." A caregiver, Ms. Johnson, approached, a clear line of worry on her brow about a stranger speaking to one of the children. Ethan quickly introduced himself, mentioning the donation he was there to deliver. She visibly relaxed, but lingered nearby. "Don't you want to play with the other kids?" Ethan asked, noticing how her gaze kept drifting to the soccer game. The girl hugged the bear tighter and shook her head. "I can't keep up," she explained, gesturing to her wheelchair. "And nobody has the patience to wait." The acceptance in her voice was all too familiar to Ethan. That quiet resignation of someone who had learned far too young that the world doesn't always bend for those who are different. "Have you lived here long?" he asked, crouching to her eye level. "Almost a year," she replied, her eyes once again on the group of children. "My younger brother was here too, but he left last month." "He left?" The girl nodded, shifting the bear in her lap. Her gaze went distant for a moment, as if seeing something beyond the courtyard. "My little brother was chosen, but not me, because I'm too much trouble." Her words landed with a simple, brutal directness, devoid of self-pity, as if she were stating an obvious fact, like the color of the sky or the shape of the clouds. It was that very matter-of-factness that struck Ethan like a physical blow, stealing the air from his lungs. He knew that feeling intimately, the sensation of being passed over, of being too complicated, too broken to be worth the effort of a family. Her words were a perfect echo of the ones he'd whispered to himself so many times, sitting alone in this very courtyard years ago. The caregiver, who had kept a polite distance, stepped in at that moment. "Grace, it's almost time for your medicine. We need to go inside." The girl nodded obediently. She gave Ethan one last glance and a small, shy smile. "Bye," she said, waving with the hand not holding the bear. "Bye, Grace," he replied, standing up. As Ms. Johnson pushed the wheelchair toward the main building, Ethan remained rooted to the spot, watching them go. The girl's words replayed in his mind. "I'm too much trouble." That sentence became a ghost that haunted him through the rest of his short visit. He handed the envelope to the receptionist, hastily signed the donation paperwork, and politely turned down an offer for a tour of the newly renovated facilities. His mind was somewhere else entirely. In the car on the way back to his penthouse overlooking Central Park, he couldn't shake the image of Grace and her one-eyed bear. The meetings that afternoon were a soul-crushing slog. While his partners discussed mergers and acquisitions, all he could picture was that sad smile, that premature acceptance of abandonment. That night, alone in his minimalist apartment, the city lights glittering below, Ethan found himself rummaging through a storage box tucked in the back of his closet. Inside, among a few scattered mementos of his past, lay a small, scuffed-up Hot Wheels car, the only toy he'd managed to keep through all his years at Maplewood. Without a second thought, he grabbed his phone and called his assistant. "Ashley, I need you to buy something for me tomorrow morning." "Of course, Mr. Walker. What is it?" "A teddy bear. The best one you can find." Silence stretched on the other end until he added, "And cancel my morning appointments. I need to pay another visit." The next morning broke with a cloudless sky. Ethan woke before his alarm, a rare occurrence in his regimented life. On his living room table sat an elegant shopping bag from a high-end toy store. Inside was a doll with soft brown hair and large, unblinking eyes, wearing a blue dress with tiny embroidered flowers and matching white shoes. Ashley had followed his instructions to the letter. The best one you can find. The doll's price tag likely equaled a caregiver's monthly salary at the center, but that didn't matter. What mattered was that this wasn't just any doll. It was something special. The driver found it odd that they were returning to the same place the next day, but maintained his professional silence. During the drive, Ethan stared out the window, lost in thought as the bustling city streets gave way to quieter suburban avenues, and finally to the tree-lined road leading to Maplewood. "I'll be a bit longer today," he told the driver as the car stopped at the gate. This time there was no envelope in his hand, just the new doll cradled carefully in his arms. The gate squeaked its familiar complaint, and the garden seemed just as small. But today, everything looked different. Details he'd overlooked yesterday now jumped out. The colorful curtains in the dorm windows, children's drawings tacked to a hallway bulletin board, the broken swing that needed fixing. He went straight to reception. The secretary recognized him instantly and smiled. "Mr. Walker, what a surprise. We didn't expect to see you back so soon." "I forgot to settle something," he said vaguely. "Is Ms. Johnson working today by any chance? I'd like to speak with her." Ms. Johnson was the senior caregiver at the center. She'd worked there back when Ethan was just another kid without a family. If anyone could tell him about Grace, it would be her. The secretary nodded and asked him to wait in the small reception area. Ethan sat uncomfortably in a chair that felt 2 sizes too small for his adult frame. The new doll rested in his lap, looking out of place in his large hands. A few minutes later, a woman with graying hair and a kind, steady demeanor entered the room. Her face was etched with the lines of decades spent caring for children, but her eyes were still lively and sharp. At the sight of Ethan, a genuine smile lit her features. "Ethan Walker," she said, using his full name just as she had when he was young. "So good to see you again." Ethan stood and shook her offered hand. He felt an unexpected urge to hug her, but held back. Ms. Johnson had been one of the few who had truly seen him during his time here. "Ms. Johnson, you haven't changed at all." She laughed, a warm, familiar sound that reminded him of bedtime stories. "You've changed completely. Look at you, a successful businessman." Her eyes fell to the doll. "And with a new friend, I see." Ethan glanced down at the toy in his hands, suddenly feeling a bit self-conscious. How could he possibly explain this? "Actually, I came because of one of the children, a girl named Grace." Ms. Johnson's smile softened into a more thoughtful expression. "Grace, of course. You met her in the courtyard yesterday, right?" Ethan nodded. "She told me something that touched me about her brother being adopted, and her not." Ms. Johnson motioned for them to sit. The room was empty, but she lowered her voice anyway. "Do you know how she ended up here?" he asked. The woman sighed, a tired but kind look in her eyes. "Grace arrived almost a year ago. Her parents died in a car accident. Her younger brother was adopted a few months later. She has very few belongings, just that old bear she brought from home. She never complains about anything, but she hasn't been the same since." Each word hung in the air like a lead weight. Ethan felt a pang in his chest, imagining the layered loss she'd endured, losing her parents, then watching her brother leave too. "How does she act day to day?" he asked, genuinely interested. "She's sweet, quiet, very mature for her age," Ms. Johnson said. "She helps the younger kids with their homework. She's patient when teaching them, but she barely plays. She just watches the others, as if she's always on the outside." Ms. Johnson paused, eyeing Ethan with curiosity. "May I ask why your interest?" Ethan looked down at the doll. Even he couldn't fully articulate it yet. "I think I identify with her." Ms. Johnson nodded, understanding without needing more. She had known him as a boy. She knew his story. "She's probably in the back garden by now. She likes to stay near the flowers when the weather is nice." Ethan thanked her and stood. Ms. Johnson watched him for a moment before adding, "It's good to see you back, Ethan, doing something like this." He only nodded before stepping out, not trusting his voice. The back garden was smaller than the main courtyard, but beautifully tended. Small flower beds framed a grassy area with wooden benches in the shade. Grace was there, just as Ms. Johnson had said, her wheelchair parked near a bed of daisies. The old bear sat in her lap, same as the day before. Ethan hesitated at the garden's entrance. Suddenly his plan felt presumptuous, invasive even. What was he doing here? What right did he have to insert himself into this child's life? But before he could retreat into his thoughts, Grace turned her head and saw him. A tiny smile of recognition touched her lips. There was no turning back now. He walked over, feeling strangely nervous. He stopped at a respectful distance and managed a natural smile. "Hi, Grace. Remember me? We met yesterday." "You're the man who talked to Buddy," she answered, pointing at the threadbare bear. "That's right," Ethan confirmed, relaxing slightly. "I brought something for you." He held out the new doll, feeling clumsy. Grace looked at the toy with wide, astonished eyes. For a moment she didn't move, as if she couldn't process what she was seeing. Is it for me?" she finally asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Yes, I thought you might like it." Grace reached out tentatively, taking the new doll. She touched its delicate dress, ran her fingers through its soft hair, and gazed into its bright eyes. Then, to Ethan's surprise, she hugged it tightly to her chest, closing her eyes for a moment. When she opened them again, they held a glow that hadn't been there before. "Her name is going to be Teddy," she declared with conviction, as if the name had been preordained. There was something in the simplicity of that moment, in the pure, unadulterated joy reflected in her eyes, that forged an instant connection. Ethan felt as if an invisible thread had been stretched between them, still fragile, but very real. "Teddy is a great name," he agreed, sitting on a bench near her chair. Grace placed Teddy next to Buddy in her lap and introduced them formally, speaking to both toys as if they were old friends meeting for the first time. Ethan watched, charmed by the seriousness with which she conducted the little ceremony. In that quiet garden, under the gentle morning sun, something began to shift. Neither Ethan nor Grace realized it at the time, but that simple gesture, a doll offered without grand words, had planted a seed that would grow into something far beyond either of their expectations. One visit turned into two. Two became three. Before he knew it, Ethan had carved out a new routine in his impossibly busy schedule. Every Wednesday at 3 p.m., his driver would drop him off at the gates of Maplewood. At first, the visits were short and somewhat formal. He brought small gifts, colorful books, crayons, a jigsaw puzzle with large pieces, and would spend half an hour with Grace in the garden. The girl awaited him with barely concealed excitement, always with Buddy and Teddy on her lap, her eyes fixed on the gate long before the appointed time. The orphanage staff noticed the change in Grace. The once quiet child who spent hours alone began to smile more. She started counting the days until the next visit, marking little boxes on a calendar Ms. Johnson had given her for that exact purpose. "How many days are left?" she would ask anyone who passed by. Over time, the visits grew longer. Ethan began canceling meetings and delegating tasks to spend more time with her. Half an hour stretched into an hour, then 2. One time he lost track of the clock and stayed until dusk, reading stories she had never heard. "Just one more, please," Grace would plead, her eyes shining with eagerness, and he would read, pouring voices into the characters, pausing for dramatic effect, watching her face light up at each twist in the tale. On a particularly hot afternoon, Ethan arrived with a larger bag than usual. Inside was a complete set of art supplies, paper of different textures, watercolors, markers, and professional-grade colored pencils. Grace's eyes widened when she saw so many colors at once. "They're all for me?" she asked, incredulous. "All yours," Ethan confirmed. "Ms. Johnson told me you like to draw." Grace picked up a red marker and examined it as if it were a precious jewel. She carefully placed the cap to one side so she wouldn't lose it, and immediately began to draw. Ethan watched, fascinated by her concentration, her tongue peeking out at the corner of her mouth, her eyes fixed on the paper. "What are you drawing?" he asked after a few minutes. "A house," she replied without looking up, "with ramps instead of stairs." It was the first time Ethan noticed the pattern. In subsequent drawings, he realized she always included wide windows and ramps. In houses, schools, stores, every building she created had those features. "Why so many ramps?" he asked once. Grace looked at him as if the answer were obvious. "So I can go anywhere," she explained simply. "And big windows so I can see outside, even when I can't go out." In that moment, Ethan understood something about her limitations he had never truly considered. For Grace, the world was filled with invisible barriers that he, with his fully functional legs, had never had to face. During another visit, he noticed how meticulously she stored every gift he brought. In a shoebox decorated with colorful stickers, she kept all their drawings, the pencils still perfectly sharpened, the markers always capped, and the small toys immaculately clean. "Why do you keep everything so carefully?" he asked. Grace shrugged, as if the question hardly needed asking. "To make them last longer," she finally said. "Things go away if you don't take care of them." The simple statement carried a weight that hit Ethan like a physical blow. For a child who had lost so much so quickly, preservation was an act of survival. On a rainy afternoon, when the garden was off limits, they stayed in the center's small library. Grace was flipping through a book on marine animals while Ethan answered emails on his phone. The silence between them was comfortable, like that of old friends who don't need to fill every second with chatter. Suddenly, without looking up from her book, Grace asked, "Do you have kids?" The directness of the question caught Ethan off guard. "No," he replied simply. "Why not?" He smiled at her insatiable curiosity. "I guess I've never met the right person to start a family with," he explained, "and I was always so busy with work." She nodded, as though the answer made perfect sense. She continued turning the pages, taking in the colorful images of dolphins and turtles. Then, without warning, she asked another question. "Did you have parents?" The question landed like a knife, slicing the quiet air between them. Ethan felt his body tense instantly. It wasn't a simple question, not for him. The silence stretched, heavy as lead. Grace looked up from her book, noticing the shift. She observed his tight expression, the way his fingers gripped his phone too tightly. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "Was that a bad question?" Her small voice pulled Ethan back to the present. He forced a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "No, it wasn't a bad question," he finally said. "It's just complicated." "Like me?" Grace asked. "I had parents, but they went away." "More or less," he agreed, choosing his words carefully. "My parents didn't die like yours. They left me here when I was little and never came back." It was the first time he had said it so plainly in years. Not even in therapy had he managed such raw honesty. He always used euphemisms, clinical terms, emotional buffers. "I was institutionalized. I lived in a care home. I grew up in the system." Never the stark truth. "I was abandoned." Grace processed the information with the seriousness only a child who has known loss can possess. "That hurts more," she stated, "because they chose to leave." The precision of her observation was a punch to the gut. That was exactly it. The searing pain of knowing his parents had a choice and had still decided to leave him behind. Memories he'd buried deep clawed their way to the surface. The first weeks in the center, crying every night, convinced his parents would return any minute. His first birthday alone, waiting for a call that never came. The broken promises. The letter he wrote at age 12 that went unanswered. Then the cold resolution he made at 14. No more crying, no more waiting, no more needing anyone. "I really miss my parents," Grace said, cutting through his thoughts. "And my brother, too. Sometimes I cry secretly when I remember my mom's perfume or how my dad used to carry me on his shoulders. Jacob, my brother, always slept with me when I was scared of storms." She hugged Teddy and Buddy tighter. "But you came back," she continued. "You came back to the place that hurt you?" The observation was so simple and so direct, it struck a deep chord in Ethan. He'd never framed it that way. Coming back to Maplewood was like confronting a past he'd spent decades running from. And somehow, meeting Grace had given that return a new meaning. "Yeah, I guess I did come back," he admitted. "You're brave," she said with conviction. Ethan almost laughed. No one had ever called him brave for something so fundamental. Daring in business, yes. Ruthless in negotiations, absolutely. But brave for confronting his own demons? That was new. "You're brave too," he told her. "Very brave." She smiled, a smile that lit up her entire face despite everything she had lost. "Can we read another story?" she asked, shifting gears with the ease only a child can. And so, Wednesdays became the highlight of Ethan's week. He, who used to measure success in acquisitions and profit margins, began to mark his best moments by Grace's expressions. The smile when he arrived, the concentration while she drew, the curiosity during story time. His colleagues noticed the change. Ashley, his assistant, commented that he seemed more relaxed, less obsessed with minute details. Mike, his business partner of over a decade, noted that he smiled more, an extremely rare occurrence in the past. "Did you meet someone?" Mike asked during a business lunch. "Yes," Ethan answered without elaborating. How could he explain that the person changing his life was a child in a wheelchair holding a one-eyed teddy bear and a doll that never left her lap? One afternoon, after nearly 2 months of weekly visits, Ethan arrived at the center to find Grace crying silently in the garden. His chest tightened at the sight of tears rolling down her small face. "What happened?" he asked, kneeling beside her chair. "Today is Jacob's birthday," she explained between sobs. "Last year we made a cake together. Mom let us make a huge chocolate mess in the kitchen." Without a second thought, Ethan hugged her. It was their first real physical contact beyond handshakes or light shoulder pats. Grace clung to him as if he were a lifeboat in a stormy sea. "It's okay to cry," he murmured. "Good memories can hurt sometimes, but they're still important." "Do you have good memories of your parents?" she asked, her voice muffled against his shoulder. Ethan thought for a moment. "Some. My mom used to sing me to sleep, and my dad taught me how to play checkers." "Do you cry when you remember?" "Not anymore," he admitted. "But I was angry for a very long time." Grace pulled back slightly and looked at him, tears still glistening in her eyes. "I'm angry sometimes too," she confessed, "at God for taking my parents, at the people who took my brother but didn't want me. It's not fair." Her honesty disarmed him. Ethan had never met anyone so direct, so free of pretense. It was like looking into a mirror that reflected not just the present, but also his own past, a past filled with unvoiced hurts and silent rages. "Anger is part of it," he said, surprised by his own wisdom. "Just don't let it take up too much space." Grace nodded, wiping her tears with the back of her hand. For a moment they both remained quiet, each lost in thought. Then she looked up at him, her face softer. "Thanks for coming today," she said simply. "Always," Ethan replied, realizing that single word held a bigger promise than any contract he had ever signed. Grace's fragile but genuine smile made Ethan realize how his own wounds were slowly healing as he helped her navigate hers. Two wounded hearts finding solace in the mutual understanding of a pain few others could grasp. Maplewood Children's Center had official visiting days. Twice a month, potential adoptive parents would come to meet the children. Those days were a maelstrom of anticipation, energy, and inevitable noise. The kids wore their best clothes, carefully combed their hair, and practiced smiling in the mirror. The air buzzed with a potent mixture of hope and anxiety. Ethan arrived on one of those days, completely unaware. As soon as he parked, he sensed the difference. More cars in the lot, unfamiliar voices echoing in the corridors, a humming, electric atmosphere. "Visiting day," the receptionist explained when she saw him. "Always on the second Monday of the month." Ethan nodded, feeling like an intruder. Normally, he would head straight to the garden or library where Grace usually waited. Now he had no idea where to find her. Amidst the commotion, he walked down the main hallway, observing the interactions. In various rooms, couples chatted with kids, playing games and asking questions. Staff members hovered discreetly, supervising and stepping in to facilitate conversations. Laughter, excited voices, and the occasional tears of a shy younger child echoed throughout. Ethan searched for Grace in all the common areas. She wasn't in the library, the cafeteria, or the back garden. Finally, he decided to ask Ms. Johnson. "Grace?" The woman sighed, her expression a mix of concern and understanding. "She doesn't join the visiting days. She never wants to." "Where is she then?" Ms. Johnson hesitated for a moment, as though weighing whether to share that information. "In the old book storage room next to the library. We turned it into a small reading nook. It's quiet there." She paused. "She doesn't like crowds or noise. Says it hurts her ears." Ethan thanked her and headed to the indicated spot. The small room was down a less traveled corridor. The door was ajar. He knocked gently before entering. The space was small but cozy. Low bookshelves lined two walls, filled with worn paperbacks. A high window let in a single beam of light that illuminated floating dust particles. In the far corner, seated at a little table, was Grace. She didn't notice him right away, too absorbed in a large illustrated book, turning the pages with meticulous care. Buddy and Teddy were strategically placed beside her, silent guardians. "May I come in?" Ethan asked softly. Grace looked up, surprised. A smile lit her face when she recognized him, but there was a different tension in her shoulders that wasn't usually there. "You came," she said, closing the book, "even though it's visiting day." "I didn't realize it was visiting day," he admitted, stepping in and closing the door, muffling the distant din. "Ms. Johnson told me where to find you." He sat on a small chair across from her. The room's silence was a welcome refuge from the rest of the center. "You don't like these days," he said, less a question and more a statement. Grace shrugged. The gesture Ethan had learned was her way of handling uncomfortable topics. "It's too noisy, too many people staring, asking questions." She positioned Teddy in her lap. "And they never look at me anyway." Her last sentence was nearly a whisper, laden with the weight of many disappointments. Ethan felt a lump form in his throat. "I'd rather stay here," she continued. "It's quiet. Books don't ask hard questions." Glancing around, Ethan noticed how the space reflected Grace's personality. Tidy, calm, full of stories waiting to be discovered, slightly removed from the world, but still with a window to observe it. "Do you want me to leave?" he asked. "I can come back another day if you'd rather be alone." Grace shook her head emphatically. "No, you can stay. You're quiet like me." The simplicity of her reply touched Ethan in a way he hadn't expected. It was true. They both shared an appreciation for silence, for calm. Over the weeks they'd spent together, many of the most meaningful moments involved no words at all, just presence. "Then I'll stay," he said, pulling out his phone and switching it to silent mode. "We can read together if you'd like." Grace smiled and slid the illustrated book toward him. For nearly an hour they turned the pages together, occasionally commenting on the pictures, but mostly enjoying the shared stillness. In the following days and weeks, Ethan began checking the center's calendar to avoid the busiest times. He discovered Grace was most comfortable on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons when most other children had off-site activities, or on Saturday mornings when many slept in. During these quieter times, they forged their own routine. Sometimes they read side by side, each with their own book. Other times, Ethan brought adapted board games that didn't require complex movements. Occasionally, they would just sit in the garden, watching the birds or the clouds, exchanging the occasional remark. One day, Miss Johnson commented on the change when she met him in the hallway. "I've never seen Grace so at ease with someone," she said. "She's always been reserved, even before the accident. But with you, it's different." "I think we understand each other," Ethan answered simply. On a particularly tranquil Saturday morning, nearly 3 months after their first meeting, they were in the back garden. The dew still sparkled on the leaves, and the air had that special quality of the early hours. Ethan had brought a book of illustrated poems. Grace listened attentively, sometimes asking to see the illustrations. After the third poem, she rummaged through her backpack hanging on the back of the wheelchair and took out a carefully folded piece of paper. "I made something for you," she said, handing it over with an unusual shyness, even for her. Ethan took the sheet and unfolded it. It was a drawing, made with the colored pencils he'd given her. It depicted 2 figures, a tall man in what looked like a suit, with dark hair and a small but clear smile, and next to him, a little girl in a wheelchair, holding what appeared to be 2 small toys, a brown teddy bear and a doll in a blue dress. At the top of the page, in carefully formed letters, were the words, "My new friend." The simplicity of the drawing and its caption struck Ethan harder than he could have anticipated. He felt a tightness in his chest, a surge of emotion so intense it briefly stole his breath. It wasn't just that he'd been depicted. It was the realization that for this child who had lost so much, He had become important enough to be called a friend. "Do you like it?" Grace asked, her voice betraying a rare nervousness. Ethan realized he'd been silent for too long, just staring at the picture. "It's perfect," he said, his voice a bit raspy. "It's the most beautiful gift I've ever received." He wasn't exaggerating. Over the years, Ethan had received expensive gifts from partners, designer watches, valuable artwork. None of them had meant as much as this simple drawing made with colored pencils. "May I put it in my office?" he asked. Grace nodded, visibly relieved and happy at his reaction. "I made it because you always come to see me, even when you're busy, even when it's hard." Her comment revealed an awareness that Ethan hadn't imagined. She had noticed the days he arrived tense, the work calls that interrupted their time, the nights of lost sleep over major negotiations. Yet he had never failed to appear on their agreed-upon days. "I come because I want to be here," he said sincerely, "because our friendship is important to me." Grace's smile was like the sun emerging from behind the clouds. For a moment, no more words were needed. Their shared silence spoke volumes, full of mutual understanding. That night in his apartment, Ethan placed the drawing in a simple but elegant frame. He stood looking at it for a long time, reflecting on how this little girl in a wheelchair had become such a significant presence in his life. The next day, he called his assistant. "Ashley, please cancel my Tuesday and Thursday afternoon appointments for the next few months," he instructed. "And also Saturday mornings." "All of them?" Ashley asked, surprised. Ethan had never requested such a regular block of time off before. "Yes, all of them. It's an important commitment." After hanging up, he looked again at the drawing on his office wall. The words, "My new friend," were so simple, yet they represented a profound transformation. For someone who had spent decades building walls around his heart, those 3 words signaled a monumental shift. The following week, when he arrived for his visit, he brought a special gift, an identical frame containing a professional photo of himself. On the back, in his careful handwriting, he'd written, "For my new friend, Grace." With affection, Ethan. When he handed it to her, her face lit up in a way that made all the stress of the previous weeks, tense meetings, tough negotiations, sleepless nights, feel insignificant. "Can I put it on my table?" she asked, tracing the frame's edge with her fingertips. "It's yours. You can put it wherever you want." Grace later explained that she kept it by her bed. It was the first thing she saw when she woke up, and the last thing before she slept, a reminder that even on the quietest days, someone was thinking of her. The silence that had once been a solitary refuge for both of them became a shared space where they didn't need words to express what was starting to grow between them. An unusual friendship built in small moments, in constant presence, in mutual acceptance. For Ethan, who had always measured his worth in numbers and acquisitions, these quiet moments with Grace were slowly teaching him a new form of accounting, one in which wealth was measured by smiles received, trust earned, and drawings pinned to an office wall. For Grace, who had learned too soon that people leave, Ethan's constant presence was gradually rebuilding something she had believed was lost forever, the confidence that not everything precious disappears. And so, visit after visit, silence after silence, an unlikely bond grew, one that had started with a casual remark about being too much trouble, and was now expressed in the 3 simple words of a child's drawing. My new friend. The rain began as a light drizzle around mid-morning and intensified throughout the day. By the time Ethan arrived at the center, the sky was a solid sheet of gray, and water poured from the gutters, creating little waterfalls around the building. The steady patter of raindrops on the windows created a curtain of sound, further isolating them from the outside world. On days like this, the children usually stayed in the common room, playing board games, reading, or watching a movie. Grace, however, preferred the small library. She said the smell of books mixed with rain was her favorite perfume. Ethan found her by the window, watching the drops roll down the glass. Her wheelchair was positioned so she could press her fingertips against the cold surface and trace the path of the water. Buddy and Teddy lay in her lap, as always, silent witnesses to her contemplation. "Hello?" he said softly, knocking on the open door to announce his presence. Grace turned, her face lighting up with a smile that contrasted with the dreary weather. Yet there was something else in her gaze that day, a shadow lurking behind her usual bright eyes. "I thought you wouldn't come," she said, "because of the rain." "I said I'd come, didn't I?" Ethan replied, hanging his wet coat on the nearest rack. "A little rain doesn't scare me." He walked over and sat in the chair next to her. They both watched the downpour in silence for a few minutes. There was comfort in these shared quiet moments, a mutual understanding beyond words. But today, Ethan sensed a question hanging in the air, some unspoken restlessness. "What's on your mind?" he finally asked, turning his gaze to her. Grace kept her eyes on the window, her fingers now still against the glass. "Why do you come see me?" she asked, her voice almost a whisper. The question caught him off guard, not so much because of its content, but because of the vulnerability in her tone. "What do you mean?" Grace finally turned to face him, her big eyes serious. "Do you come here because you pity me?" The question was like a punch to Ethan's gut. For a moment he was speechless, searching for the right, honest response. "No," he said at last, with a conviction that surprised even him. "I come because you're the best part of my day." And as soon as he said the words, he realized how true they were. Over the past months, his visits to Grace had become the highlight of his week. On days he didn't come, he often found himself wondering what she was doing, what new drawings she might have made, what stories she might want to hear next. Grace's features softened at his answer, but there was still a hint of hesitation in her eyes. "Even though I'm too much trouble?" she asked, her voice tiny, almost fearful. That phrase, "too much trouble," echoed back to the first time he heard her speak in the courtyard about her brother's adoption. The same insecurity, the same doubt about her own worth, simply for being who she was. Ethan leaned forward and gently took her small hand between his own. "Grace," he said, looking straight into her eyes, "you're not trouble. You're special." Something broke in the girl's expression, maybe a defense against hope. Her eyes filled with tears, but they were different from any he'd seen before. Not of sorrow or pain, but something deeper, more complex. Without warning, she leaned forward and hugged him, her thin arms around his neck, her face pressed into his shoulder. Ethan returned the hug carefully, not squeezing too tight or tipping her wheelchair. He felt her tears soak his shirt, but he said nothing, simply holding her, offering the silent comfort of his presence. When she finally pulled away, Grace smiled, a different smile, lighter, as though a weight had been lifted. "You're special too," she said, with the simple directness only children can have. The rest of the afternoon passed peacefully. They read, drew pictures, and chatted about small things. The bird nesting in the window ledge, the new book Miss Johnson had brought to the library, the shapes of the clouds once the rain eased. The rain continued, but less intensely. Ethan watched Grace draw, admiring the focus on her face. She had a steady, confident line. Even in her simplest sketches, she never hesitated when choosing colors or setting down shapes. It was as though, on paper, all her insecurities vanished. "What are you drawing?" he asked, leaning in to see. "Our favorite tree," Grace replied, pointing to the window that offered a view of the garden where an ancient oak stood, its leaves gleaming in the rain. "Ours?" Ethan repeated, smiling at the way she so naturally included both of them in a unit. "Yes," she said, not lifting her eyes from the page. "You always sit under it when you come to see me in the garden." Indeed, over the months they'd formed small rituals, special places, fleeting moments that belonged only to them. The tree was one of those places, a meeting point, a refuge on warm afternoons, a constant amid many changes. As the afternoon turned into evening, Ethan realized he'd have to leave soon. But before that, there was something he wanted to do, something he'd been putting off for weeks. "Grace, do you mind if I check out something before I go? I won't be long." She nodded curiously. "Where?" "I want to see something from when I lived here." Understanding crossed her face, followed by genuine curiosity. "Can I come too?" Ethan hesitated a moment. What he wanted to see was personal, a fragment of his past he'd kept hidden for years. But something in Grace's expectant expression made him nod. "Sure, I'll ask Miss Johnson to help with your chair on the stairs." Ms. Johnson not only helped, but insisted on accompanying them, explaining that the wing where Ethan had stayed was under renovation, and they needed her permission to enter. Ethan realized she might also be curious about his reaction to revisiting that space. The third floor of the main building looked smaller than he remembered. The corridors that once seemed huge now felt narrow, almost claustrophobic. The walls that used to be a dismal institutional green were painted a light yellow, more welcoming. Ms. Johnson stopped in front of a door labeled Bunk Room 3. "Still remember where your bed was?" she asked. Ethan nodded. How could he forget? 6 years in that same room, in the same bed, staring at the same window on sleepless nights. Ms. Johnson opened the door, and they went in. The room was empty, no mattresses on the beds, ready for renovation. But the basic layout remained. 5 metal-framed beds lined up against the wall, high windows, a small built-in closet where they kept their few belongings. "It was right there," Ethan said, pointing to the second bed on the right. "My bed for 6 years." Grace studied everything carefully, as if trying to picture the boy Ethan had been, sleeping there, living in this space. Ethan walked slowly around the room, his footsteps echoing on the bare floor. He stopped by the wall next to where his bed had been and crouched, carefully examining a specific spot near the baseboard. "It's still here," he murmured, more to himself than to the others. Ms. Johnson joined him, curious. "What are you looking for?" Gently, Ethan scraped away a small bit of loose plaster, revealing faint chalk marks. "What's that?" Grace asked, moving her chair closer to see. Ethan smiled, a smile full of memories. "Something I wrote when I was 10. The words, written in a shaky child's handwriting, were partially legible. "One day I'm leaving this place." "We've painted this wall at least 3 times since you left," Ms. Johnson commented, surprised. "Amazing how some things endure." Ethan touched the fading words, feeling an unexpected emotion, not bitterness or resentment as he might have felt years ago, but a kind of compassionate understanding for the boy he'd been, so determined to escape, so desperate to belong somewhere. "I used to write that every night before going to sleep," he explained, still gazing at the nearly erased marks. "Like a promise to myself." "And you kept that promise," Ms. Johnson observed. "Yes," Ethan said softly, "but not in the way I expected." At that moment, he realized something he'd never considered. Even though he had escaped physically, part of him had remained in that place all along, in those secret words, in that childish desire for freedom, in the memories, both painful and sweet, that he carried. "I thought leaving here meant leaving everything behind," he continued, turning now to Grace. "That I could just erase it all and start fresh." "But you can't, right?" Grace asked with a wisdom that belied her age. "No," he agreed. "You can't, and maybe you don't need to." They stood in silence for a while, each absorbed in their own thoughts. It was Grace who finally broke it. "Can I touch it?" she asked, reaching her hand toward the wall. Ethan nodded and helped maneuver her chair. With careful reverence, Grace ran her fingers over the almost invisible words, as though sensing through them the boy Ethan had once been. "Were you sad here?" she asked, looking directly at him. The question, so direct and honest, took Ethan by surprise. His first instinct was to protect Grace with a half-truth, something gentle that wouldn't make her uncomfortable. but he realized she deserved more. Sometimes, he admitted, there were very hard days, but there were good moments too. Friends, caregivers like Miss Johnson, little victories. Like surviving, Grace concluded, again showing that uncanny understanding. Like surviving, Grace repeated with a perception that took him by surprise again. Yes, he agreed. Like surviving. Sensing the intensity of the moment, Miss Johnson discreetly suggested heading back downstairs. The rain had stopped entirely, leaving the air clean and fresh. The courtyard glistened with puddles, reflecting a sky that was starting to clear. "Can I show you something, too?" Grace asked when they reached the garden. "Sure," Ethan replied. She directed her wheelchair to a specific spot in the courtyard near the main gate. From there was a perfect view of the entrance, the street beyond the walls, the world outside. "I come here every day," she explained, "to see who arrives." Ethan understood instantly. It was the perfect place to watch for visitors, potential adoptive parents, anyone who might change her destiny. It was the lookout of someone who waited to be chosen. He had once had his own lookout spot, years before, in a different corner of the courtyard, but with the same vantage point on the gate, the same mix of hope and fear. As they walked together across the courtyard, Ethan smiled softly and said, "When I was your age, I lived here too." Grace looked at him surprised. "You lived here?" Ethan nodded. "For a few years, I also waited, watching that gate." She observed him silently, as though she understood more than words could explain. "Then," she said softly, "so you know what it's like?" He gave her a sad smile. "I do. That's why I come back." In that moment, they shared an understanding that went beyond age or circumstance, an understanding built on a shared experience of waiting, of watching a gate with a mix of hope and fear, of wanting to be chosen, yet fearing rejection. The sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the damp courtyard. The other children had come out to enjoy the end of the rain, running around and laughing as their voices echoed in the open space. Ms. Johnson had stepped away to keep an eye on them, leaving Ethan and Grace alone with their thoughts. "You know what I wanted most as a child here?" Ethan asked, watching the kids at play. Grace shook her head, waiting for him to continue. "Someone who understood," he said. "Someone who knew what it was like without me having to explain." Grace nodded, her eyes locked on his. "Me too." "And now," he asked, "what do you want most now?" She thought for a moment, her fingers idly fidgeting with the fabric of her dress. "Not to be scared," she finally answered. "Scared of what?" "Everything," she said with disarming simplicity. "Of being chosen, of not being chosen, of being too much trouble, of being alone." The raw honesty of her words struck Ethan to the core. He recognized in them his own childhood fears, fears he still carried in more adult guises. "You know something," he said, kneeling so he was at her eye level. "It's normal to be scared. Everybody is, even grown-ups. But you're braver than you think." "How do you know?" "Because I see how you face each day, how you take care of your toys, how you do your drawings, how you read your stories. All of that, even when it's hard. That's courage." Grace took in his words, searching his face for any sign of insincerity or empty reassurance. She found only truth. "You're braver, too," she finally replied. "You came back to a place that made you sad." That observation, so simple and direct, brought forth a truth Ethan hadn't fully grasped until that moment. Coming back to the center was not just about charity or a good deed. It was also about facing his past, healing old wounds that had never properly closed. "I guess we're brave together then," he said, holding out his hand to her. Grace smiled and placed her small hand in his. "Together," she agreed. And so, under a sky gradually shifting from blue to gold, then tinged with the first purples of dusk, a child who was afraid of being chosen, and an adult who still carried the scars of never having been chosen themselves, found a moment of peace. Not because their circumstances had changed, but because they were no longer alone in their fears. Sunday dawned clear and mild, perfect for what Ethan had been planning for weeks. He woke earlier than usual, triple-checked a small backpack he'd packed the day before, and drove to the center well before the time he'd arranged. He felt a kind of nervousness he rarely did, even in multi-million-dollar executive meetings. He had spoken with the center's administration and, after a mountain of paperwork, obtained special permission to take Grace out for a few hours. It required signing numerous documents, providing references, and even going through an interview with her case's social worker. Ms. Johnson had helped a lot, vouching for Ethan's trustworthiness and the benefits of the outing for Grace. Grace still didn't know. Ethan wanted it to be a surprise. When he arrived, he found Grace already awake, having breakfast with the other children at a communal table. She smiled when she saw him, then frowned in confusion. He never came on Sundays, and certainly not this early. "Good morning," he said, approaching. "Ready for a surprise?" Grace blinked, intrigued. "What surprise?" "How about spending the day away from here, just the two of us?" Her eyes widened. She looked at him, then at Ms. Johnson, who came over with a smile, then back at Ethan. "I can leave?" "We have special permission," he explained, "for a few hours, but we have to be back before dinner." For a moment, Grace seemed unable to believe it. Then, slowly, the biggest smile he'd ever seen spread across her face. "Where are we going?" she asked, already pushing her cereal aside, excited for the adventure to begin. "It's a surprise," Ethan repeated, "but I think you'll like it." An hour later, Grace, wearing a blue dress she'd specifically chosen for the occasion, was in Ethan's car. Ms. Johnson helped load her collapsible wheelchair in the trunk and gave Ethan final instructions about Grace's medications and special care. Grace insisted on bringing Buddy and Teddy, her inseparable companions. "They've never left the center either," she said solemnly. "They need to see the world." Their first stop was a small flower conservatory on the outskirts of town, the Bellflower Conservatory. Ethan had discovered it by chance while looking for a birthday gift for his assistant. It was a family-run place, not large or sophisticated like a big botanical garden, but it had a special charm and, crucially, was fully accessible for wheelchairs. When they arrived, Grace fell silent, taking in the view. It was a modest structure of glass and metal, surrounded by small outdoor flower beds. What caught her eye wasn't the size, but the colors. Hundreds of different flowers creating a living mosaic of reds, pinks, yellows, purples, and whites. "It's like being inside a rainbow," Grace murmured as Ethan pushed her wheelchair along a path of smooth stones. The owner, an older lady with calloused hands and a gentle smile, came to greet them. Ethan had called ahead, explaining the situation, and she had prepared a little surprise for Grace. A flower crown made of small daisies and sprigs of lavender. "For the princess of the garden," the woman said, placing the delicate wreath on Grace's head. Grace touched the petals gently, almost reverently. They spent almost 2 hours there. Grace wanted to see every type of flower, learn their names, touch their petals, and smell their scents. Ethan watched, enthralled by her delight, by how her eyes lit up with each new discovery. The owner, noticing Grace's genuine interest, gave her a small potted plant she could care for herself. A violet with an intense purple hue that, according to the woman, bloomed year-round if treated kindly. "Just like you," she said, gently touching Grace's cheek. "Small but strong." As they left, Grace held the violet in her lap alongside Buddy and Teddy, and Ethan announced the second part of the surprise. "How about some ice cream now?" Grace's face lit up again. "Real ice cream? At an ice cream shop?" Ethan laughed at her question, which revealed so much about the limited life she'd led. "Yes, real ice cream in a real shop. You can pick any flavor you want." They went to a small ice cream parlor in the city center, Scoops and Smiles. It wasn't busy at that hour, no crowds, no curious stares at Grace's wheelchair. They sat by the window. Grace examined the colorful menu with an expression of utter concentration, as if faced with the biggest decision of her life. "You've had ice cream before, right?" Ethan asked, suddenly worried. "Sometimes at the center," she replied, eyes still on the menu. "But only chocolate or strawberry, and in small cups. Here there are so many flavors." After much deliberation, she chose a dish with 2 scoops, chocolate and pistachio, a combination that made Ethan smile at her sophisticated palate. He ordered the same in solidarity. Watching Grace eat her ice cream was an experience in itself. She savored each spoonful with complete focus, as if memorizing the taste. There was no rush, no childlike urgency to gobble it before it melted. There was only pure pleasure at tasting something special, something not in her normal routine, something that might not happen again soon. "This is the best day of my life," she declared between bites, her tone so serious it squeezed Ethan's heart. Right then and there, in the glow of the sun streaming through the window onto Grace's smiling face, her flower crown slightly askew, and a bit of chocolate ice cream smudged by her mouth, Ethan had a sudden impulse. He took out his phone. "Can I take a picture of you?" he asked. Grace looked surprised, but nodded, straightening up and smiling, a genuine smile that reached her eyes and lit her entire face. Ethan captured the image and immediately knew it was special. It was more than a photo. It was a record of a moment of pure joy, possibly the first time Grace had felt that kind of happiness since the accident that took her parents and left her in a wheelchair. He showed her the photo, and she examined it curiously. "Do I look pretty?" she asked with the insecurity typical of her age. "Beautiful," Ethan replied with absolute sincerity. Back at the center by late afternoon, Grace was exhausted but radiant. She carefully held the violet as though it were a precious treasure. Buddy and Teddy had also tasted the ice cream. In reality, Grace had offered them each a tiny spoonful so they could share the happiness. Ms. Johnson met them at the entrance, and Grace immediately started recounting every detail about the flowers, the ice cream flavors, and how people on the street smiled at her in her flower crown. While listening to her describe each moment, Ethan glanced again at the photo on his phone. He decided right then that he'd print it and frame it for his office, alongside the drawing she'd given him. But on his phone, he'd keep it in a special spot, a reminder he could carry anywhere, a talisman against bad days, stressful meetings, and the loneliness he'd often felt even when surrounded by people. The drive back to his place had never felt so long. While navigating the city's evening lights, Ethan felt torn between the joy of the day just past and a growing restlessness he couldn't ignore. He kept seeing Grace's radiant face in his mind, the way her eyes sparkled over the pistachio ice cream, the reverent care she showed the little violet. His apartment felt strangely empty when he finally arrived. It was a stylish place, decorated with the minimalist taste he'd always favored. But now, for the first time, he sensed its oppressive silence, its lack of life. He set his keys on the coffee table and walked to the balcony, looking out at the city. Thousands of lights glittered in the darkness, thousands of lives unfolding simultaneously while he stood there alone with thoughts he couldn't manage. He took out his phone and looked again at Grace's photo. There was such purity in that smile, something that reminded him of a distant time when he still believed the world could be kind. For years, Ethan had built his life around work. He had what many would call success, money, recognition, power, but none of it had prepared him for what he felt now, for the space this little girl in a wheelchair had opened in his heart, a space he hadn't even known was there. He sat in his favorite armchair, the one with a sweeping view of the city, and did something he hadn't done in a long time. He allowed himself to feel, really feel, without the barriers he normally kept so carefully in place. What he felt was overwhelming. The day with Grace hadn't been just an outing, some charitable act for a lonely child. It was a glimpse of another life, of another version of himself, one that could be more than the successful businessman, more than the orphan who overcame adversity, a version that could be a father. The word floated through his mind, both frightening and irresistible. Father. Something he had never seriously considered, something he had deliberately avoided. Ethan had never planned to have children. He told himself it was because of his career, his lifestyle, a lack of time. But the truth, now painfully clear, was fear. Fear of failing. Fear of not being good enough. Fear of repeating, in some way, the abandonment he himself had suffered. How could he be a good father if he'd never had one to learn from? How could he provide stability, safety, unconditional love, things he'd never received? And yet, Grace? He thought of how she faced life with a courage many adults didn't have, how she smiled despite her losses, how she found wonder in tiny joys, how she kept every small treasure as if her life depended on it. He thought of how she understood him in a way no one else seemed able to. There was a quiet strength in her, a resilience that stirred him deeply. He knew her case file, the medical reports, the psychological evaluations. The doctors considered it unlikely she'd walk again. He knew about the medications, the therapies, the special needs. He knew that anyone adopting her would face challenges most people weren't prepared for. But he also knew, with a surprising certainty, that none of that mattered. What mattered was that smile, those perceptive, intelligent eyes, that spirit which, in a strange way, seemed to complement his own. He stood and went to his office. Hanging on the wall was Grace's drawing, still in its place of honor. "My new friend," the simple inscription said. He stared at it for a long moment, letting the reality of what he was considering take full shape. Adopting Grace, giving her a permanent home, a family, even if it was just the two of them. A place where she'd always be the first choice, never left behind. A place where being too much trouble wouldn't matter because the love would be unconditional. The thought brought with it a wave of panic. Could he really do this? Could he raise a child? Change his entire life? His priorities? His future? What if he failed? What if he ended up hurting her or letting her down, just like his own parents had done? He sat at his desk and opened his laptop. He began searching about adoption, about children with special needs, about what it meant to be a single father. Hours passed as he absorbed information, statistics, and personal accounts. His hands trembled slightly, a physical sign of the battle raging inside him. He stopped when the sun started to rise, painting the sky pink and orange beyond his office window. He was exhausted, emotionally spent, but something had shifted. The idea that had felt so terrifying hours earlier now had more defined, tangible contours. It wouldn't be easy. It would require profound changes in his life. He'd have to learn, adapt, grow in ways he'd never imagined. He'd have to face his own demons, his own fears. But maybe that was exactly what he needed. Maybe the cycle of abandonment that had defined his childhood could be broken, not only through personal success, but through a deeper act of love, the commitment to be for another child what no one had been for him. He looked again at Grace's photo on his phone. Deep down, he realized the decision had been made the moment he saw her alone in that courtyard, saying she was too much trouble. Or maybe even before that, somewhere in the depths of his soul, where the child he once was still waited for someone who would never return. He closed his eyes and, for the first time in a long while, allowed himself to dream of a different future, one that included a child's laughter echoing through his previously silent apartment, colorful drawings taped to the fridge, bedtime stories and comfort for nightmares, tough questions and honest answers, shared fears overcome together. A family. The days following that sleepless night passed in a slow-motion blur for Ethan. What had started as a terrifying idea had crystallized into a deep certainty. He made phone calls, rearranged his schedule, and restructured his entire agenda. His lawyer, David, surprised by the urgency, worked overtime to prepare all the necessary documents. "Are you sure about this?" asked David, his attorney of over a decade and probably the closest thing Ethan had to a friend. "This is a huge decision. Maybe you should think it over a bit longer." "I've never been so sure of anything in my life," Ethan replied, surprising even himself with how certain he sounded. "The process wouldn't be simple or quick," David explained. "There would be interviews, home visits, psychological assessments, background checks. Even with Ethan's resources and influence, it would take time. The adoption system's red tape made no distinction between millionaires and ordinary people when it came to determining parental suitability. But the first step was straightforward, formally declaring his intent. That was exactly what Ethan planned to do that morning. He arrived at the center earlier than usual. The familiar screech of the gate greeted him, but this time it sounded different. Not just a reminder of a painful past, but an announcement of a future full of possibilities. Instead of heading straight for the garden or library, he went to the administration office. The folder he carried felt like it weighed a ton, though it contained only a few documents. The formal notice of his intent to adopt, and the initial paperwork for what would be a long process. The receptionist, used to his frequent visits, seemed surprised to see him in that part of the building. "I'd like to speak to Mrs. Stevenson, please," Ethan said. "It's an important matter." Eleanor Stevenson had been the center's director for over 2 decades. She took over shortly after Ethan left, so she hadn't known him as a child, but she'd spoken with him several times since he began visiting Grace, mostly about procedures for off-site permissions. After a brief wait, Ethan was ushered into her office, a welcoming room, its walls lined with framed children's drawings and photos of smiling kids. Ethan wondered how many of those children had found homes and how many were still waiting. "Mr. Walker," Mrs. Stevenson greeted, standing to shake his hand. "What a pleasant surprise. How can I help you today?" Ethan sat in the chair she indicated, placing the folder on her desk. He took a deep breath. "I'm here about Grace," he began, his voice steadier than he'd hoped. "Specifically, her future." Mrs. Stevenson nodded, her expression neutral but attentive. "I want to adopt her," Ethan said, finally voicing what his heart already knew. "I want her to know, every day, that she was chosen." For a moment, there was only silence. The ticking of the wall clock seemed unusually loud. Beyond the window, he could hear children's voices, faint laughter and shouts in the courtyard. Mrs. Stevenson's expression shifted from surprise to something softer, more emotional. "Mr. Walker, Ethan," she said, dropping the formality. "Your dedication to Grace these past months has been extraordinary. We've seen changes in her we never thought possible." She paused, choosing her words carefully. But adoption is a lifelong commitment, especially in Grace's case, with her special needs, her trauma. "I know exactly what I'm getting into," Ethan interrupted gently but firmly. "I've done my research. I've talked to specialists. I've started adapting my apartment. I'm prepared." Mrs. Stevenson smiled, a genuine smile that reached her eyes. "I believe you," she said, "and honestly, I can't think of a better home for Grace." She was about to continue when a soft noise at the door caught both their attention. They turned to see Grace in her wheelchair with Ms. Johnson just behind her. "Pardon the interruption," Ms. Johnson said, looking embarrassed. Grace was looking for Ethan and— "It's quite all right," the director said, motioning them inside. "In fact, this conversation primarily concerns Grace." The girl looked from one adult to another, her expression inquisitive. She clearly sensed the serious atmosphere, but didn't know exactly what was going on. "What's happening?" she asked, staring directly at Ethan. "You look weird." Her blunt remark, so typical of Grace, broke the tension in the room. Ethan couldn't help smiling. "We were talking about you," he explained, moving to stand closer to her. "Something important." "What?" she insisted, clutching Buddy and Teddy as though bracing for bad news. Ethan exchanged a glance with Mrs. Stevenson, who nodded encouragingly. "Grace," he began, crouching to meet her eyes. "I spoke with Mrs. Stevenson about the possibility, about my desire to adopt you, to have you come live with me and be my daughter." The words hung in the space between them. Grace's face was a canvas showing surprise, confusion, doubt, and something more, something Ethan couldn't quite read. She didn't smile right away, as he might have expected. Instead, her eyes grew very serious, almost adult in their scrutiny. "What if I'm not what you expect?" she finally asked, her voice small but resolute. The question cut Ethan to his core. It was exactly what he'd feared in reverse, that he might not be the father she deserved. And here she was, voicing the same worry, but from her own perspective. Ethan crouched down further to be at her level, looking into her eyes with gentle firmness. "Grace, I don't expect you to be anything but who you already are. You don't have to prove anything. You're already everything I want." Grace's eyes filled with tears, though not of sadness. It was as if something very old and very heavy finally gave way inside her. "Really?" she whispered. "Really," he confirmed. "I want you to be my daughter, not despite who you are, but because of who you are." Grace looked down at Buddy, her tattered, one-eyed bear, and then at Teddy, the doll Ethan had given her. It seemed she was consulting her oldest friends, seeking their approval. At last, the smile broke, not just polite or forced, but radiant, transforming her entire face. "I do want that," she said with a quiet simplicity that held whole worlds. "I want to be your daughter." The months that followed were filled with paperwork, interviews, home visits, and preparations. The adoption process moved faster than usual, partly due to Ethan's resources, partly because the center's staff unanimously supported it. During that period, Ethan visited Grace almost daily. Together, they planned what their new life would be like. He showed her photos of his apartment, asked about her preferences, and involved her in every decision. It was important she felt that this new chapter was being written by both of them, not just him. "What color do you want for your room?" he asked one afternoon, showing her a paint catalog. Grace ran her fingers over the swatches, stopping at a soft lavender shade. "This one," she said confidently. "It looks like the sky just before it gets dark." A week before the official move, Ethan took her to see what would be her new home. The apartment had undergone a transformation. Hallways had been widened to accommodate a wheelchair. Small ramps replaced any steps, and furniture was rearranged for easier movement. Subtle changes, but they conveyed, "This place was prepared for you." Her bedroom, however, was anything but subtle. The walls were painted the exact lavender she had chosen. A canopy bed stood at the center, dressed with a quilt embroidered with tiny flowers, reminiscent of the crown she'd worn on their greenhouse outing. Low bookshelves lined the walls, perfectly reachable for someone in a chair. There were also toys, though not in an overwhelming quantity, each chosen with care. A giant teddy bear occupying a corner armchair, dolls of various ethnicities, a box of large building blocks, and a complete art station with materials beyond anything the center or even Ethan had previously provided. But at the center of everything, 2 small doll beds by the head of the big bed sat empty. "Waiting for Buddy and Teddy," Ethan explained, seeing her curious look. "I thought they might like their own beds, though they can still sleep with you, of course." Grace's eyes filled with tears. She didn't say a word, just opened her arms. Ethan hugged her, understanding every unspoken sentiment. On the official moving day, Ms. Johnson helped pack Grace's few belongings, some clothes, carefully stored drawings, favorite books, and, of course, Buddy and Teddy. It all fit into a single small suitcase, the sum of her 8 years of life. "Take good care of her," Ms. Johnson told Ethan, watching as Grace said her goodbyes to the other children. "She's stronger than she looks, but also more fragile than she lets on." "I promise," Ethan replied, feeling the weight and privilege of that responsibility. Arriving at the apartment was simultaneously solemn and joyful. Grace wanted to see every room again, this time knowing she was seeing her permanent home. She paused to touch the furniture, look out each window, absorbing the reality of this new life. In her room, she unpacked her suitcase with meticulous care, assigning each item a specific spot. Ethan watched from the doorway, offering help only when asked. He instinctively understood this was an important ritual for her. "Would this be okay?" he asked when she hesitated about where to place a stack of drawings. "Yes," she answered with a small smile. "That way, it feels like it's mine." That phrase became a kind of mantra in the following days. Whenever she arranged something, she'd confirm, "Like this, it feels mine." It was as though she was gradually claiming not just the physical space, but the very idea of belonging. The first few days were a delicate dance of mutual learning. Ethan discovered that Grace was an early riser, but liked to lie in bed for a few minutes, watching the morning light. He learned she preferred crustless bread, hated the sound of the blender, and softly hummed to herself when she drew. Grace discovered that Ethan sometimes worked late, that he made coffee way too strong, and that he rarely laughed, but when he did, his whole face lit up. Most importantly, she learned that when he said, "I'll be right back," he really did come back. There were challenges, of course. The first night was tough. Grace woke up disoriented, forgetting where she was. Ethan found her silently crying, clutching Buddy and Teddy. "It's okay," he whispered, sitting on the edge of her bed. "You're home now." "How do I know I won't leave this place too?" she asked, her voice tiny in the dark. "Because this is our home now, yours and mine, forever." "Promise?" "I promise with all my heart." She fell asleep holding his hand, both of them needing that physical connection. Soon they established routines. Breakfast together was non-negotiable, even if Ethan had an early meeting. He adjusted his work schedule, setting up a home office for days he didn't need to be at headquarters. Grace had therapy sessions, physical, occupational, and occasionally psychological. But Ethan made sure there was time to just be a kid. Bedtime became a special ritual. At first, Grace felt shy about needing help, but she soon discovered Ethan turned it into an adventure, with pirates and mermaids making the necessary aid feel more like fun. He never treated her limitations as a burden, just a challenge they faced together. Together, they created their own traditions. Wednesday nights were movie marathons with popcorn. Sunday mornings meant pancakes, typically ending in a kitchen covered in flour and laughter. On rainy afternoons, they built blanket forts in the living room and read stories inside them as if they were in another world. The apartment began to bear the marks of their combined presence. One corner of the living room became known as Ethan's Nook, where he read the newspaper after dinner. A spot by the kitchen window was dubbed Grace's Observation Tower, where she liked to watch the city at sunset. The hallway to the bedrooms was decorated with her drawings, framed as if they were museum pieces. In Grace's room, Buddy and Teddy held a place of honor. The doll beds were rarely used because the two companions still shared her pillow every night. Ethan realized their presence brought her comfort. They represented continuity, a sense of permanence in a life marked by loss. There were mistakes and adjustments, of course. Ethan, used to living alone, sometimes forgot to keep things within her reach or would move furniture without warning. Grace, accustomed to the center's strict structure, sometimes struggled with her newfound freedom to make choices. But every mistake became a chance to learn. When Ethan placed her favorite cups on a shelf too high, the solution wasn't just retrieving them for her, but installing new pull-out shelves at her level. When Grace had an anxiety attack after accidentally breaking a cup, afraid he'd be angry, he didn't just say it was okay. He showed her, time and again, that her worth wasn't tied to being perfect. "We all break things sometimes," he explained as they cleaned up the shards together. "Things can be replaced. People can't." One evening, about 3 weeks after she moved in, Ethan passed by Grace's bedroom following a work call and found her lying awake, staring at the ceiling. "Can't sleep?" he asked, sitting on the edge of her bed. She shook her head. "I'm thinking." "About what?" She was silent for a moment, organizing her thoughts. "How different it feels." "What does?" "Being chosen," she said simply. "It's different from what I imagined." "How did you imagine it?" Grace hugged Buddy and Teddy closer, as if drawing courage from them. "I thought I'd have to be different, happier, smarter, easier," she said, pausing. At the center, people always wanted the easy kids. Ethan's heart clenched to hear such an adult perspective from someone so young. "Being chosen doesn't mean you have to change," he said gently. "It means someone saw who you really are and thought, 'That's exactly who I need in my life.'" She considered that for a moment, then smiled, a slow smile that began small and gradually spread like a sunrise. "I think I like that definition." "Me too," Ethan agreed. "Now go to sleep. Tomorrow's a big day." "Full of good things?" "Full of our things," he corrected. "Some will be easy, some will be hard, but they'll be ours." She nodded, satisfied with his honest reply. As her eyes drifted shut, still clutching Buddy and Teddy, Ethan realized that these first days together were teaching them the same fundamental lesson. That family isn't just about sharing good, easy moments. It's about creating a space where you can be completely real, fears, flaws, hopes, and all, and still be loved. And that, more than lavender walls or new toys, was the true home they were building together, one day at a time, mistake by mistake, smile by smile, with the old teddy bear and the new doll sharing the same pillow, silent witnesses to a brand new beginning. The seasons began to change. Winter gave way to spring, bringing golden leaves to neighborhood trees and cooler morning breezes. For Grace and Ethan, that change of season mirrored the transformations in their own lives. A new cycle was beginning, full of possibilities. 2 months had passed since Grace moved in. Their routines felt more established, the spaces in the apartment more familiar, and the silences between them more comfortable. There were still moments of adjustment, of course. Sometimes Grace would wake up crying at night, missing her parents. Some mornings Ethan woke up anxious, terrified he might be incapable of giving her everything she needed. But these uncertainties, rather than driving them apart, seemed to strengthen the bond growing between them. One particularly sunny Saturday morning, while they were having breakfast, Grace kept staring at the empty space between the bookshelf and the main window in the living room. "What are you thinking?" Ethan asked, noticing her concentration. "That corner," she said, pointing. "It looks empty." "What do you think should go there?" Grace pondered for a moment, absently poking at her cereal. "Maybe my drawings and some toys," she ventured, hesitating like she wasn't sure if her idea would be welcome. "It's our home, but sometimes it still feels too yours." That observation hit Ethan with sudden clarity. It was true. Despite the adaptations for Grace, much of the apartment still felt like his old life. Minimalistic, stylish, adult, neutral tones, designer furniture, abstract art on the walls. It all spoke of the life he had before she came. "I think that's a wonderful idea," he said with a smile. "In fact, let's make it our weekend project. Sound good?" Grace's face lit up. "Really?" "Of course. It's your house, too. It should have your touches everywhere." That very afternoon, they went to a home goods store. Grace selected simple light wood frames for her favorite drawings, some brightly colored pillows, and a low bookcase to display her treasured toys. Ethan watched her choose, surprised by how seriously she weighed each option, considering how each would fit the space. "This matches the sofa better," she explained, choosing a blue pillow over a red one. "It makes the room feel calmer." Ethan smiled, impressed by her developing aesthetic sense. There was so much more to her than he yet knew, and each new discovery was fascinating. On Sunday, they devoted themselves to creating Grace's Corner, as it came to be called. Ethan hung the frames at a perfect height for her to view them from the wheelchair. Together they arranged her toys on the new shelf, the giant teddy bear on guard, the picture books lined up by size, the building blocks in a translucent box so the colors could be seen. Buddy and Teddy, however, were not part of this display. When Ethan suggested a place of honor for them, Grace shook her head. "They sleep with me," she said firmly. "They only come to the living room when I'm there." It was an important distinction, Ethan noticed. There were display toys, and then there were essential companions, those that carried history and comfort beyond mere decoration. By By the end of the day, the corner had been transformed. The framed drawings formed a small gallery of children's art, colorful horses, big windowed houses, and of course, the increasingly frequent family drawings she made. A tall man in a suit and a girl in a wheelchair, hand in hand, always under a smiling sun. From her wheelchair, Grace surveyed the final arrangement, her eyes shining with satisfaction. "Now it feels like my home, too," she declared, smiling as though the entire room lit up with her. Something in that statement touched Ethan deeply. The idea that a space could transform from his home to their home simply through some framed art and well-placed toys felt both simple and revolutionary at once. In the following days, he noticed Grace frequently pausing by her corner, rearranging a toy or admiring her drawings. It was as though that little claimed territory offered her the security to gradually make herself at home in the rest of the apartment. One afternoon, watching from the kitchen window, Ethan saw something that subtly changed his perspective. Grace was in the condo's small garden, pushing her wheelchair along the stone path by herself. There were obstacles, small inclines, tight turns, patches of loose gravel. But she maneuvered them with determined patience, sometimes backing up to try another approach. His first instinct was to run to help her, but something made him wait and simply observe. He watched the concentration on her face, the satisfaction when she cleared a difficult stretch, the patience when she had to try again. There was no frustration in her repeated attempts, only a calm resolve. In that moment, Ethan realized Grace didn't need him to save her. She only needed him beside her. She didn't want every obstacle removed from her path. She only wanted the reassurance that he'd be near if she needed help. He went downstairs to the garden, but rather than rush to assist, he sat on a nearby bench. "Exploring?" he asked casually. Grace nodded, skillfully navigating around a larger rock. "I'm mapping things out," she explained. "I need to know where I can go alone and where I'll need help." The practicality of her approach impressed him. Instead of lamenting her limitations, she was identifying them, working within them. "You learn anything useful?" he asked. "Yes," she replied, stopping next to the bench. "I learned I like trying by myself first." "I think that's very wise," he agreed. "And if you ever need me, I'm here." She smiled, that slow grin that started in her eyes and spread across her face. "I know." That simple affirmation, "I know," carried a world of trust Ethan wasn't sure he'd earned yet, but was determined to live up to. That night, after dinner, they sat in the living room for their usual bedtime reading. Grace picked a book about a family of rabbits who rebuild their home after a storm. The story was about cooperation and how each family member contributed something different. When they finished, Grace stayed quiet for a moment, absently stroking Teddy's hair as Buddy rested on her lap as well. "What did you think of the story?" Ethan asked. "I liked it," she said. "But they had to build a new house because they lost their old one." Ethan nodded, sensing how the story could stir difficult memories. "Yes, sometimes we lose things we love and have to build something new." Grace didn't speak for a while, still stroking the doll in her arms. "I miss my parents," she said finally, her voice small yet steady. "But now I have a new family. You made me smile again." The simple words washed over Ethan like gentle but powerful waves. He felt his eyes grow moist, making no effort to hide his emotion. "You made me smile again, too," he admitted. It was true. Before Grace, his life was filled with professional success, but very few moments of genuine joy. Now, even on hard days, there were flashes of laughter, shared discoveries, small triumphs they celebrated together. That night, as he tidied the kitchen after putting Grace to bed, Ethan pondered how his idea of home was shifting. He'd always thought in terms of physical structures, walls, furniture, and a dress. But he was beginning to realize that home was not just a place, but a feeling of belonging, acceptance, emotional safety. Grace's corner in the living room was more than just decoration. It was a statement of permanence, a visual affirmation that she wasn't a visitor in his life, but an essential part of it. In the same way, her acceptance of this new reality didn't erase her past, but bridged it into a future they were building together. As he turned off the lights, Ethan paused briefly at the corner they'd created. In the dark, only the shapes were visible, but that was enough. That small, personalized space had turned his apartment from a residence into a home, a place where both could be exactly who they were, with all their histories, wounds, and hopes. A place that now belonged to both of them. Winter gave way to spring. Flowers began to bloom in the small condo garden, and the mornings held that unique light only the lengthening April days can bring. 6 months had passed since Grace moved in with Ethan, 6 months of adjustments, discoveries, little victories, and the occasional stumble. Life had found its own rhythm. Ethan continued his work, but with a more flexible schedule, holding many meetings from home. Grace attended a new school adapted for her needs, where she was making friends, and, to Ethan's delight, showing a special knack for art. She still attended therapy, physical, occupational, and sometimes psychological. But these no longer dominated her schedule as before. The apartment, too, had evolved. Grace's corner in the living room had expanded, and now included a small art table, always littered with ongoing projects. Her framed drawings were no longer confined to that space. They appeared everywhere: the fridge, the hallway, even the bathroom. Gradually, the neutral tones and minimalist decor Ethan once preferred had given way to color, texture, and the signs of a shared life. Grace herself had changed, not just in how she'd grown a bit taller or put on some weight. Her cheeks were fuller, her eyes more lively, her smile more frequent. Her hair, once kept in uneven braids for practicality, was sometimes loose now, falling in soft waves around her shoulders. Subtle transformations that reflected her well-being and sense of safety. Ethan also wasn't the same. The always immaculate executive was now sometimes spotted at video conferences with flecks of paint on his fingers or a forgotten hair tie on his wrist. He smiled more, slept better, and for the first time in decades, kept personal photos in frames around his office, not just Grace's original drawing, but actual pictures of them together. One particularly pleasant Saturday morning, Ethan took advantage of the sunshine to tidy the condo's small garden. The other residents rarely used it, and he had permission to plant flowers and herbs he knew Grace would love. Wearing worn clothes and gardening gloves, an image that would shock his colleagues, he pruned some shrubs, humming absent-mindedly. Grace was on the adjacent balcony that overlooked the garden, seated at a portable drawing desk. She worked intently on some project, occasionally looking up to watch Ethan, then returning to her art with renewed inspiration. A serene closeness settled between them, each engaged in their task yet aware of the other's presence. "What are you drawing?" Ethan asked, removing his gloves for a break. "Our house," she said, turning the paper so he could see. The drawing did not depict their real apartment, but an imagined house, bright, whimsical, with large circular windows, a shiny red door, and ramps instead of stairs. In the garden, 2 figures, a tall one and a smaller one in a wheelchair, were planting flowers together. In the sky, in addition to the ever-present smiling sun, were 2 special clouds containing 4 faces. Grace's parents and brother, Ethan realized, plus one who seemed to be a younger version of him, perhaps the boy he once was. The emotional complexity of the picture deeply moved him. It wasn't just a fantasy house, but a representation of how Grace saw their new family, connected to the past, yet building something new. "It's beautiful," he said sincerely, "especially the round windows." "They're like hugs for the light to come in," she explained with the peculiar logic of childhood that often hides profound truths. Ethan sat on the step of the balcony near her wheelchair. For a few moments they simply appreciated the garden and the peacefulness of the morning. There was a comfort in these shared silences that Ethan had never experienced in any other relationship. "Can I ask you something?" Grace finally said, her tone suddenly serious. "Of course. Anything." She hesitated, twisting a colored pencil in her fingers. Did you really choose me? The question took Ethan by surprise, not so much for what it asked, but for the timing. After 6 months together. Why now? Of course I did, he said, leaning closer. You know that. But she frowned, clearly grappling with complicated feelings. All those people who visited the center and never chose me. They saw my wheelchair, my complications. Why were you different? In her words, Ethan heard layers of insecurity he thought had been put to rest. But he understood some wounds take a long time to heal. Maybe something happened at school, a passing remark or just her own introspection that revived old fears. He chose his words carefully, knowing they mattered. I think we chose each other, he finally said. I wasn't looking to become a father when I first came to the center. I was just there because, well, for my own reasons. But then you spoke to me, showed me your world, and something changed. Something I can't fully explain. Grace listened intently, soaking up every syllable. When you meet the right people, he continued, it's not like picking out a present in a store. It's more like recognizing someone who was meant to be in your life, even if you didn't know it yet. A small smile formed on Grace's face. So it wasn't pity. Definitely not, Ethan assured her, sensing this had been her biggest fear all along. It's because you're exactly who I needed in my life. Without realizing it, I'd been looking for you for a very long time. Grace mulled this over, then nodded, seemingly satisfied. She resumed coloring her drawing, adding more details to the imaginary garden. You're not too much trouble either, you know, she said casually, not looking up. Ethan raised his eyebrows, amused by her remark. I'm not? No, she said, now grinning mischievously as she lifted her eyes to him. You learn fast, too. You can almost braid my hair without any tangles. Ethan laughed, recalling his disastrous first attempts at braiding her hair, messes that looked more like bird nests than neat braids. I'm improving, huh? Yes, Grace said with a theatrical pause, but you still need practice. They both laughed at the inside joke, recalling rushed mornings with Ethan wrestling hair ties and following YouTube tutorials. It was moments like these that surprised Ethan the most, not the big milestones or notable achievements, but these small daily interactions that had quietly turned two lonely lives into a family. The journey wasn't linear or always easy. There had been nights of nightmares and days of insecurities, practical challenges of living with a child with special needs, moments of doubt about whether he could be the father Grace deserved. There was the night she had her first high fever and the panic he felt rushing her to the ER at 3 Saulage in the morning. The first parent-teacher conference at her new school where he felt out of place among couples who seemed to know exactly what they were doing. The time Grace cried inconsolably on the anniversary of the accident that took her parents, and he feared nothing he did would be enough to ease her pain. But for every difficult moment, there were also wonderful discoveries. The first time Grace called him Dad, without fanfare or planning, simply over breakfast, while asking him to pass the jam. The afternoon she managed, after months of therapy, to move from her wheelchair to the couch on her own, the pride shining in her face worth more than any business success Ethan had ever had. The Christmas they spent together, creating their own traditions that mixed old memories with new hopes. With every obstacle, every challenge, something unexpected happened. They grew stronger together. It wasn't Ethan rescuing Grace, nor Grace healing Ethan's past. It was more complex, yet simpler than that. Two imperfect people, scarred in different ways, finding in each other's vulnerabilities the strength to move forward. The truth, clearer now than ever in the spring sunshine, was that they hadn't saved each other. They had rebuilt themselves, brick by brick, day by day, in an ongoing process that would likely last a lifetime. Watching Grace on the balcony, sunlight dancing in her hair, Ethan felt a profound gratitude, not just for the happiness she brought him, but for the person he was becoming through her, more patient, more present, more capable of seeing beauty in small, everyday moments. The true home they had built wasn't simply the apartment with its ramps and Grace's corner, nor even the fantasy house in her drawings with the hug windows. Their real home was in the invisible spaces between them, the trust slowly gained, the routines formed, the comfortable silences, the laughter over messy braids. They had built the most special kind of house, one that existed in each other's hearts, a house with no walls or limits, one that no one could ever take away. A house where the wounds of the past weren't erased, but welcomed and woven into the new story they were writing together, day after day. A house where they would never be alone again. If this story touched your heart, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next ones. Leave a like because it helps this story get recommended to more people.